As crises and conflicts are deepening all around the world, there is an increasing need for humanitarian assistance. How can we help vulnerable communities? How can we support them to be stronger, more resilient? This is Voices for Resilience, the podcast of the Netherlands Red Cross. In this series, we will answer some of these pressing questions. How can we support people to live in a world where droughts and floods are more and more frequent and intense? How can communities adapt to stay safe and still have food, water, and jobs? Hi, I'm Stefania Giudini. I'm leading the team working on water, climate, and environment at the Netherlands Red Cross. In this episode, with the help of my colleagues Sirac, Michelle, Marai, and Iker, we will show you how we see the life of communities changing due to climate change and how intervention in water management can help adapting to new situations. What I find interesting is that if you are attending global conferences on climate change, everyone speaks about climate and how temperature, currents, rainfall is changing. It remains all pretty abstract and somehow far away from your own life. When instead I talk to people experiencing the effects of climate change, the talk is all about water. Dry wells, water rationing, them experiencing more damaging from flooding. We believe that communities can become stronger against the risks of climate change if they can cope with the risks and damage brought by water. And this is why we focus our work on water. When I started at the Red Cross, I learned about WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene, which is often interpreted as water tracking and explaining how to wash your hands. If we want to really address the issues brought by climate change, we need to get out of that limiting picture and start thinking water. Water for health, water for food, water for livelihoods and jobs. Sirac Temesgen works in my team at the Red Cross as a community resilience advisor. He travels all over Africa supporting the Red Cross national societies on resilience building. Resilience is the capacity of a community to bounce back after a major crisis. It tells us how things have changed in the last years.
In the Horn of Africa region, in most of climate vulnerable communities, climate change impacts people through water. Drought and flooding is not really new to the communities. And from their experience, from their indigenous knowledge, they used to know how to cope, how to manage the drought and flood impact in their own context. For example, migration has been considered as one of the best coping strategies among the pastoral communities in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. When there is a drought in the southern part of Ethiopia, people used to migrate to cross the border to the Kenyan side and just stay there for a while until the situation in their area improved, and they will go back. The same for Kenyans. They know also how they split their herd. They know how to manage their pasture land, rangeland, and water resources. But now, with the climate change impact, communities who used to face drought once in a 10 years period, now they are facing every 2 years, every 1 year, basically sometimes even every year. So the communities, before they recover from one drought, they are facing another drought. There is also a population pressure. There is also a change in terms of the ecosystem. You can see the ecosystem degradation, etc. All these factors made that their traditional coping system is no longer efficient or adequate enough to help the communities to survive. That is why we need now to engage the community. Look, you can no longer live the way you used to live. So we are trying to help them now to see the changing context and also what it means for them in terms of their livelihood, in terms of their access to water, in terms of access to firewoods, etc. The community can easily be affected by extreme weather events. You may invest in the community in infrastructural development. You build water structure, roads, schools, etc. But with this extreme weather event, a rain Heavy rain, which might really like pour in the communities within like 2 3 days, can destroy the entire investment you made for years. That is why we promote anti-flood reaction, but we are also equally promoting long-term risk reduction measures through nature-based solutions, etc., that could help communities address root cause of people's vulnerability. Concrete example, we implemented a very good soil and water conservation activities in the Ibnat Warada of Amhara region in the northern part of Ethiopia. That's also a drought prone area. We have done soil and water conservation measures with the community. The community conducted an assessment. They told us those hills in that area were vegetated. The community were telling us they were having water sources, they were having adequate pasture, adequate grasses for their livestock from the hills which have been forested hills. But those hills have been degraded because of deforestation. So the community made area enclosure. They closed the area from human and animal interference. We provided drought tolerant multi-purpose trees and the area completely changed. Do you know what happened? Two disappeared springs came out because of the improved vegetation in the area. The underground water discharge improved, soil erosion reduced, and now the springs came out. And now people were telling us, can you help us with small micro irrigation projects so that we can cultivate some vegetables? So we supported them. Micro irrigation because the water access, we improved the water access availability, and then now they want to diversify their livelihood. And we supported them. Not only that, also some of the youth they were saying, okay, look guys, after this area is completely restored, we start seeing bees. So we want to have, rather than using our traditional beehives, can you support us with a modern beehive so that we can produce honey? It was not initially part of the project design. But now, after the area is restored, these bees are coming to this restored forest area, and these guys saw opportunity. And keeping bee, it will give economic opportunity and also supports the pollination in the area, which is good for the biodiversity of that area.
I often get a surprised reaction when I explain that the Red Cross works also on preventing crises. For the longest time, we have been known as the emergency response organization. Well, with the humanitarian funding shrinking, it was realized that prevention and resilience building make response cheaper. So, to prevent major diseases outbreaks, food insecurity, or destruction of villages by flooding, we engage in a different kind of preventive action involving water management. Ike Geo, a water management advisor with the Netherlands Red Cross, tells us about some of these activities in Haiti.
There are phenomena today that are affecting the whole planet. For example, Mali and Haiti are suffering from droughts. El Nino is a phenomenon that happens every 2 to 7 years. How does this affect Haiti? First, there is water insecurity. There is no water and the harvests are delayed. The communities sometimes start selling their animals and eating their seeds because they have to keep living. But then we are not having only water insecurity, but also food insecurity. Over 50% of the population in Haiti is food insecure. All this leads to increasing poverty, but there is also floods. The patterns of rain are more erratic, are more unpredictable. It is not that there is no water, but when there is water, there is very heavy rain. So they cannot rely 100% on rain. They're very dependent on their crops. If rain is not coming, they are having a big problem. And then when it comes also, there's the problem of mosquitoes, for example, waterborne diseases like cholera, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, like chikungunya, like yellow fever. And at the end, there are also conflicts and they are forced to migrate if they do not find a solution to this. The last alternative is just to pack and go because there is no hope. Water management is the control of water resources to have beneficial and more efficient use of it. It might be for human consumption, for productive purposes, for the environment. We can use it for irrigation or for just consume. Maybe this approach, it's less known because most of the time we hear about disasters and emergencies and we are most focusing on quick responses. But this is something that demands more time addressing risks that are facing by communities. We are considering the social part, the economic and natural factors. In this concrete example, in Haiti, we started working in 2015 there, and we found out that the problems facing this community in ground fund was actually that every time there were heavy rains, the runoff of water was completely devastating all the area. The water was running down the mountain and was washing away all the crops. There were floods in the village. Main problems we had here is that there was a lack of vegetable cover. This is one big challenge because the erosion here is very big. The best way to address this, we created mechanical barriers, let's say gray structures. The idea is to reduce the force of water to gather these sediments into these barriers. So we are creating deposits of sediment which also are carrying nutrients. So in a way, you are terracing this mountain. And this is something that led to the community also having flatter areas. They were going there to put more crops and to plant in there. These flat areas in the middle of the mountain, this terracing makes that every time it rains, the water it's infiltrated into the subsoil and the water table goes higher. We found out that there was a small water source there, and it was amazing how the water flow dramatically changed from 9 liters per minute to over 100, which is enormous for a community who was suffering from lack of safe water and also that was completely dependent on the rain for harvest to plant. We decided to divide the area into 3 zones. One is what we call the natural zone. So in this natural zone, we would more plant trees and vegetables and plants. This is done in the mountain where the slopes are more steep. Then there is this other area very close to the village, which is more flat. We talked to the communities. They proposed to use this area for production. So this is the productive area. And then we've got a mixed zone. So it's in the middle where we are combining both planting trees with fruit trees with other crops. And at the same time, it's also important to work on, let's say, short-term crops that the community will collect within 6 months, but also more long-term, which, like, for example, coffee, that we know that it's going to take several years before it starts producing. The combination of both makes a good switch, and diversification. For example, banana trees will not stand winds of more than 60 kilometers per hour. So if everything that is planted is banana trees, then we are done after a hurricane is passing by. But by combining and putting banana trees, sugarcane, and acacia coffee beans, then we don't put all the eggs on the same basket. We're diversifying. And also to complete the intervention, normally there is the social component, which is key in all this. So it's about the mobilization and sensitization of the communities. We introduced practices to improve sanitation, also household water treatment. After the hurricane passed by, one of the most impressive things was that the community was not very much affected, not major significant losses in assets or life at all of human or animal.
I read somewhere that by 2100, 2/3 of the population will live in cities, which means most of the Red Cross work will be in cities. Working in urban environment is different than working in the countryside. When talking about water management, we have to work with the city water providers, the so-called public water utilities. This gives us opportunities to create a new innovative way of working. Marit Zwart is a WASH advisor with the Netherlands Red Cross and tells us how, in urban settings, we move from community engagement to consumer engagement for water.
When we talk about the problem of water and sanitation access in urban context, I would say that the biggest problem is the fact that we are not achieving our SDG 6, the one for universal water and sanitation access. In fact, we are regressing. 10 years ago, the urban coverage was better than currently. Of course, we are sort of successful in connecting more people to safe services, but we are catched up by urbanization. So urbanization is going so quick, population growth is going so quick that the coverage in urban context is decreasing. Because of climate change, we're seeing more humanitarian needs in urban context because there's more cities, more bigger cities. Also, more cities will be hit by floods, by droughts. Way more floods and droughts are occurring, causing humanitarian needs. We as a sector are actually not very well prepared to address those urban needs. In order to be prepared for a disaster, we need strong utilities. We need pre-emergency partnerships. We need to know each other. We need to trust each other. We need to speak each other languages before the disaster hits to actually work together cost effectively and quickly and with proper quality for that life-saving humanitarian support at time of the disaster. There is a whole group of very progressive water utilities, Ghana is one of them, that are building in pro-poor mechanisms to actively reach out to those low-income communities. There's a very big part of the urban Ghanaian population, mainly the low-income part, that does not have access to a household water connection. They pay a high price, that they have lower quality of water, that there's this health risk, there's the safety risk, the dignity risk. That's one problem. But there's also the other problem that is actually more global, but needs to have a local solution. That's the fact that we are seeing that specifically in the urban context, water and sanitation utilities, service providers are not capable of extending their services to the full population, often leaving out the most poor. And they are also not well included in our current humanitarian coordination mechanisms. So what happened in Ghana, which I think can be copied in any context, is that the utility, together with the Red Cross and together with the specific communities, community leaders, female groups, religious leaders, create a joint session to address specific behavior goals for becoming a sustainable and responsible water user, because we need people to be responsible water users to get successful utilities. In this pilot, we have two groups of the target population. One are the unconnected. So those are people that are living in areas where currently there was not yet water company pipe network service available. The second target group is the people that are living in areas where water company already has extended their network, but those are areas where there is a higher risk of unresponsible water use, meaning that bills are not paid, that leakages are not reported, that there is distrust between communities and the Ghana water company, causing potentially to people being disconnected again. The problem of the unconnected is first that they need to want to register to become a water user. One reason for people to not want to register is the cost of the household connection. And it's quite expensive. So the water company is introducing these subsidized water connections with support of the Ghana Red Cross. But people need to be informed about what that means, like for them financially. And then there is still this 30% of the cost that they need to pay themselves. But then, of course, after you have registered, you become a connected person. And then the problems of the two groups are the same. You basically need to be able to pay your bill. And even though people paid their bill before or paid higher cost before for alternative water sources, like from private water vendors, that was small bits of money every day. And now you need to save because you're paying it once a month altogether. In addition, you need to be careful about how you use it because it's what you're going to pay for. And so it's impacting your cost, your bill, but also it's impacting the water availability in the system. You need to understand your water meter. You need to understand how that water meter reading translates into a bill, what your cost per cube of water is, for example. And you also need to know where to go when you have questions. The most challenging is actually the joint water payment, that almost everyone in the low-income communities in Ghana, they live together in a compound with multiple families. And they have one water meter. So they get one price, but every family has different numbers of children and they live with the sister. So how to organize yourself and trust each other well. And in Ghana, there's very nice experience of Red Cross volunteers that are organizing first in their own compound and later in others as well. Just discussion evenings for everyone to sit together and to discuss the issue of our joint water bill and to agree on some way of distributing. As the Red Cross is a volunteer-based organization, we're rooted in communities. We have a lot of experience in successful community engagement and behavior change. I would say that improved professionalized community engagement is something we can almost everywhere add. And that is in changing behavior, but also in helping utilities and better understand the needs of the communities they want to serve.
Because we are an organization that helps people, sometimes we forget that people are not helpless. Not at all. Michelle Becks, water management advisor at the Netherlands Red Cross, always likes to remind us that supporting the scale-up of water management ideas that the community comes up with is sometimes the best approach.
So what is happening in Beira is it's a coastal area and there is a lot of water actually coming from the sea, tidal waves, storm surges, but it's also alongside a river. So people are very much in a very shallow, low-lying area and it's almost at sea level. Without the embankments, the water just rises very quickly. And it's not a lot. It's 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters. But the problem is, since a lot of people living in a very uncontrolled way, the drains that should actually get rid of the water, they're blocked. They can be blocked by earth or by waste. And because that whole system is so blocked, even when you have a small rain shower, on top of the tidal waves, it brings flooding, especially in the rainy season. In Beira, there are at least 60,000 people that are living in areas that flood very regularly, 20, 30 times a year. And what it means for them is that every time the water gets into their homes, a lot of people, they don't have anywhere to go to. It can happen in the middle of the night. There's no system to warn people. There are no communal shelters where they can go to. So the only thing they can do is just stay in their homes, get everything on the table, the things of value. And then there are families that will then stay the whole night sleeping on those tables. And that's the daily reality of people in those urban areas. The role of the Netherlands Red Cross is threefold, I think. You can prevent, you can work on anticipatory action, and there will always be a risk that something happens, and that's when you provide the humanitarian assistance. And what I mean with prevention is making sure that families are aware of the different measures they can take to make sure that water doesn't enter their homes. For me, water management really means is how people themselves can cope with problems such as too much, too little, and too dirty water. What we often see is that organizations take a really more technical approach, while there's so much capacity in communities to do small things to improve their lives, to be better prepared against disasters. And that is, in essence, what water management is. It's not these complex, huge programs where you come with all this technical equipment, but you work with communities for them to protect themselves better. You have to bring that discussion to where it belongs. And then you will realize that people, they know very well what their problem is, and they do have great ideas that are often way more realistic, cheaper, and probably also it will contribute to sustainability. When working with communities, one of the biggest barriers is actually how do you connect, how do you engage with communities in the first place? Instead of coming with standard solutions, it's really important to listen to really understand what their problem is. If you ask people, you often get a different perspective. And if you understand that perspective well, that's when you can start talking about the ideas that they have and the solutions. In a place such as Beira, what we actually notice is that people, maybe without calling it adaptation to climate change, they are taking measures. Some of the measures that we saw that were already taken by community members themselves include raised platforms. So they live on small plots in very low-lying areas, and then they increase the height of the place where they're going to build their house with 15, 20 centimeters. And that's already a huge impact. They are raising, for example, their doorsteps. Only by just increasing that small threshold, those 10 centimeters, it's a few less days water. That's not something you see when you're in the office, but when you speak to people, you actually realize that they're taking those measures, but their neighbor might not do that. And then you can start that conversation like, okay, what do you think of it? What kind of assistance, what would you need to also replicate that? A lot of the small canals that are in between the houses, they get clogged up with rubbish. There's so much plastic in many of these communities, and that plastic blocks, and then the water will just increase in the houses which are upstream. So what some communities do, they make actually filters made of reed so that the plastic doesn't get into those canals. And that's a very simple green-blue measure that people can actually do themselves. And it will definitely help to prevent those canals from blocking. Another measure is that some people will make sure that next to their houses, there is a place where the water can actually just flow towards small depressions, like small lakes, small ponds, where people are not yet able to build. Sometimes you see that they fill them, but you don't want them to fill it because these small ponds, they actually play a very important function in the water management. Because when you are in a group of houses and in the middle there's a small depression and it's often connected to a canal, so the very first part of the rains, if it rains for 1 hour, the first hour it will collect in the pond instead of it flowing into your house. So what we really ask people to do is not fill it up with rubbish or fill it up with earth, but keep them as they are. And you can still plant rice. And that's what a lot of people are doing. They're using it as a small rice plantation. So that's a double effect. You can also eat or sell the rice. The Red Cross, we are good in emergency assistance, early warning, early action. The governments might be better in the waste collection. So you all need to kind of put the community itself central and become service providers to them. And I think that is when resilience will work. We cannot fill it in for them. There's a very natural relationship already with the government. And what we see is that there's a lot of openness for them to also learn from what the Red Cross is good at and what they can bring to the table. You really see that interest, and they are asking to share what we are doing and what we are learning. And that really gives quite a good feeling, because then they also understand their own limitations and they know we need a longer term collaboration to make sure that we can really make that difference.
It is truly a changing world. The challenges that people are facing are changing. And with it, the work of the Red Cross, our work, is changing. From wash to water, from emergency to more resilience, from the countryside to the cities, but always for the people, with the people. If you want to know more about this topic, just Google one of our recent projects, Water at the Heart of Climate Action. That's it for today. It was Voices for Resilience, the podcast of the Netherlands Red Cross. My name is Stefania Giodini. It was a pleasure sharing these stories with you. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.